Good morning. Thank you for joining us once again on our Sunday morning service. I don't have much to go over today. Our men's group is meeting on Monday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl or Pastor Carlos know and they'll get you set up with that. Our ladies group is meeting on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, get a hold of Deanne or myself and we'll get you set up to be part of that. We'd love to have you join us. Today is just our normal tithes and offerings. If you want to give, you can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, set it up as a one-time gift or a recurring gift. You can give to our missions or to our virtual wall that way also. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you'd like Carl or I to come by and pick up a check, we'd be happy to do that also. So that's really all I have to cover today. We'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl.
Well, good morning, Father's House. Good to be here today with you again. Penny was short and to the point today, so I guess that gives me more time to talk. Not that I'll need it. I'll try to be rather brief as well. Well, not as brief as her because I do have some things I have to cover, but want to get to the point. Anyway, we're glad to have you with us. Getting ready to close out this this week, find out who is going to the Super Bowl and who's not going to the Super Bowl. And I have a prediction that I'm going to make concerning the Super Bowl. And I'm going to be 100% right. My prediction is, if the 49ers win this next game, they're going to the Super Bowl. That's my prediction. I'm just saying. So, you know, if you want to lay odds against that, you can go ahead and do that. But that's my prediction. Is if the 49ers win the next game, they will be going to the Super Bowl. So anyway, with that, I have to show you something. I did get a new item here. These are called my Kittle glasses. You know, the guy, the tight end for the 49ers? Well, he's got these glasses that he sells. So I saw them, and I needed a new pair of reading glasses. And I'm not a 49er fan, but they've had a great year, and they have a strong team. And I saw those glasses and thought, well, I just got to order them because I need a new pair anyway. So, hey, look at me in my new Kittle glasses. So that means I probably have to go for the 49ers the rest of this year. Even though I am not a 49er fan, I just got to go that way if I got to choose one or the other. So go 49ers, whether they make it to the Super Bowl or not. But we'll figure that one out. Anyway, last 2 weeks, I guess, it was, or was it just the last week we talked about temperance? I guess just the last week we were talking about temperance. The week before that, we finished up courage. We're talking about the virtues, and we're talking about those things that add to and make up wisdom in us, godly wisdom, and those things that become the virtues by which our lives become solid and immovable. Last week I wasn't at church because Penny and I were under COVID protocol. And so Carlos Amaryllis did the speaking. And I had the opportunity to watch the video afterwards because it was recorded. And he made a statement that was very profound on there. And he was talking about the idea of virtues in the idea of transcendence, or virtues transcend our reality. And I want to stop and talk about that for a minute, because what we're talking about when we talk about virtues transcend our circumstances. It basically means that because we possess certain virtues, our circumstances, they don't matter what they are, whether they're good or they're bad, whether they're trying or they're not trying, because the virtues are beyond that, because wisdom's beyond the circumstance, because it's what would you call it, almost an immaterial spiritual fabric that all of us have in our lives, when those are the things that we develop in us. And there are things that have to be developed. We just don't automatically become courageous or wise or a person of self-control, which is temperance. And those things that's just not the way that it happens. It's something that we learn by habit of applying ourselves and persevering in those matters. So without much further ado, I want to go back to our controlling scripture that we talked about last week when we talked about this virtue of temperance, or the notion or the idea of self-control, because they're kind of synonymous. Although probably the overall definition of temperance is probably a little bit broader than just the notion of self-control, although self-control is a big part of it. Because we could talk about, well, you have self-control over your eating, self-control over your drinking, or your sexual appetites, or something along those lines. But in the broader sense, I'm also talking about the idea of temperance and having self-control over your emotions, which is something over anger, having self-control over depression when it's not something that's not biologically caused, or whatever the case might be. And so it's not just our actions, but it's also the things that are in us, our appetites, our desires, our will, if you want, and having self-control to rationally think through what's the best to do in any given situation. And when you do that, and you think through that thought process, then what you find is that you have a self-control that's continually growing because you're thinking about things before you do it. It's kind of like when you're younger, when I was younger, and if I wanted to get a new truck, I didn't really think about it. I just went out and bought a new truck because I knew I could pay the payment, or maybe I could pay the payment, maybe it was a stretch or whatever, and I didn't give that much thought to it. I just went out and bought it. And sometimes after a year and a half, you go, what did I buy that vehicle for? Now I'm stuck with a payment and I shouldn't have bought this truck, or whatever. You have the regrets because you weren't self-controlled when you bought the vehicle to figure out if you should buy it, shouldn't buy it, if it's the right vehicle, whether it's the right price. All you knew is you wanted that truck and you were going to have that truck. So as you get older and after a few experiences, you don't buy a truck that way anymore, or a house that way, or anything else. You really tend to think it through before you make those actions. Well, at least you should. But talking about the virtues, and today talking about self-control, I want to go back to 2 Peter and pick up for a minute this idea of godliness and the idea of virtues. So in chapter 1, verse 2, it says, "Grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord, seeing that his divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and godliness." So he says that his divine power is provided for us to everything concerning life and everything concerning godliness. God will supply the power for us to live a virtuous life, or a life of godliness. But that doesn't mean it stops there. He provides the power, but it's our responsibility to employ that power, to activate that power, cause that power to work. So let's go on and look at it this way. Peter then goes on saying this, seeing that his divine power has granted us everything pertaining to life and godliness through the true knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and excellence. For by these he has granted to us his precious and magnificent promises, so that by them we might become partakers of the divine nature. So what Peter's saying is, he wants us to be partakers of the divine nature, that those things are important for us, and that God wants us ultimately to be partakers or participate in these attributes or these virtues of God or the divine nature. And he says, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. Now he says, now for this reason, also applying all diligence, so we've got to be diligent, right, in our faith. And he says, supply virtue, or in this case, he says, supply moral excellence, which is the exact same thing. So he wants us to have virtues, not just faith, but the idea of virtues. Now notice what he says here, right? And in your moral excellence or virtue, knowledge. He wants us to acquire knowledge. Now this just isn't just any kind of knowledge. This is the knowledge that's talked about in the book of Proverbs, when they talk about acquire understanding and knowledge pertaining to wisdom. Because everything we're talking about by way of virtues are all the offspring or the rivers that come out of this well of wisdom, this living well of wisdom, if you would have it, right? So it says, now for this reason also, applying all diligence in your faith, supply virtue, and in your virtue knowledge, and in your knowledge, get this, self-control or temperance. And in your self-control, perseverance. Your self-control should be persevering, not a one-time thing, but a constant thing. To your perseverance, godliness. And to your godliness, brotherly kindness. And in your brotherly kindness, love. Now, notice what Peter says here. For if these qualities are yours and are increasing, they render you neither useless nor unfruitful in the true knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. But he who lacks these qualities is blind or short-sighted, having forgotten his purification from his former sins. In that case, therefore, in both cases, brethren, be all the more diligent to make certain about his calling and choosing you. For as long as you practice these things, you will never stumble. I love that, because what he's saying is, as long as you're practicing the virtues, and then when you're walking in these virtues, then what's going to happen is, in life, no matter what you go through, you're not going to stumble. You're not going to find yourself in a demise that you don't want to be in. And that's why when we talk about this idea of self-control, it becomes so big for us. Temperance, same word. Last week I talked about what the difference was, or the extremes of temperance. Temperance being a mean, right, between abstinence on the one side and excess on the other side, or extravagance on the other side. And it's this mean between the two. And last week I kind of talked about what temperance isn't. And I talked about, or what it doesn't look like. And so we talked about Samson and Delilah and his lack of self-control. And I said that sometimes it's better to know what self-control looks like by what it isn't than what it is. So this week I'm going to show you another example of what self-control doesn't look like. And then next week and the following week, we'll talk about what it does look like. But this week, I want to pick up a story out of the Old Testament, who was the first king of Israel, and his name was Saul. Now, most of us, if we could pick it up in 1 Samuel, and so in the first part, beginning of that book, you'll find the story after Samuel's calling, he was a judge, and then him being called to appoint Saul as king. Saul becomes king, but Saul has some character flaws, if you would have it, that permitted him from becoming a good king. And so one of those flaws that he had was that he wasn't a man that was given to self-control in some different areas. Let me give you an example. So one day, Saul had stirred up the camp of the Philistines because they were fighting. They were their arch enemies, and they were fighting against one another. Same way we talked about last week when we talked about the idea of Samson and Delilah, and he was battling, remember, the Philistines, and it was Delilah, a Philistine, that he fell in love with. And so here we see this struggle going on later on in the life of Saul and in the people of Israel. And because they're natural enemies, they're always at war with one another. Well, Saul goes and stirs up the Philistines, and in stirring up the Philistines, they're going to come around and there's going to be a battle that's going to happen. So the Philistines line up on one side and Israel lines up on the other side, and they're going to go to battle. But in going to battle, before Saul could go to battle, or Israel could go to battle, they had to wait for a priest to come and to offer a sacrifice to God before they went into battle, because they were looking for God's blessing on the matter. Now remember that a sacrifice can only be done by a priest. Not just anybody could present the sacrifice. It had to be by way of a priest, an act of worship. So anyway, they had waited there for 7 days, and Saul was waiting for Samuel to come, being a priest. He was waiting for Samuel to come and for Samuel to make the sacrifice. Well, Samuel was delayed, and probably was delayed by the Lord, because God wanted to test the faithfulness and the self-control of Saul. So what happened is that as it got delayed and more delayed, rather than going into battle with the Philistines, a lot of the army began to abandon Saul, and they began to leave while they were waiting. So Saul kind of looked at the situation and said, gosh, we've got to fight the Philistines. This is his rationale, right? And a bunch of my army's leaving, and they're scattered, and they're going other places. And Samuel's not even here to offer a sacrifice to God. And so he's thinking to himself, I've got my army leaving. They're waiting for us to fight. I'm ready to get this thing on and fight. And then so what he does is, in a moment of the lack of self-control, he says, forget it. Samuel's late. He knows he should have been here on time. I'm ready to go into battle. I'm the king. He should be here because I'm the commander of all of the army here in Israel. So Saul decides to going to take matters into his own hands, and he slaughters the sacrifice himself. Now remember, he was not a priest. He was a Benjamite. He had no right to do what it is that he did. In other words, in the midst of the fact that he's wanting to go to battle with the Philistines, and there's this tension there, and his army that is leaving, he lacked the simple self-control at that time to wait for Samuel to come along and to make the offering. Whether it happened an hour later or a day later, it didn't matter. It had to be done by the priest. Samuel comes a little while after that, and he looks at Saul, and he says, Saul, what's this? Who slayed the offering? Who was it that did it? And he said, well, because you weren't here and you were running late, I decided to do it myself. And Samuel just looked at him and Saul and said, Saul, you have no idea what you just did. In your lack of temperance, what you've now done is you've disqualified yourself from being the king of Israel any longer. In other words, his lack of self-control disqualified him to be used further by way of God, by way of being a king. It didn't happen immediately that he lost the kingdom, but it started that day, and it began to move forward until a new king, which would be King David, came into play. In what we see in the story when we're talking about Samson and Delilah, and in the story of Saul, that's very similar, is both of them lacked temperance. Samson had fallen in love with Delilah. He was doing things with her that he shouldn't have done with her. He let his guard down. And because of his lack of self-control sexually with her and running his mouth the way that he was running his mouth, he lost his right to judge Israel or to be the judge of Israel because of his lack of self-control. What we see in Saul is because of his lack of self-control, the exact same thing happens. He loses his right to be the further king of Israel because he can't control himself. And in God's mind, to be a judge of Israel or to be a leader of the people of Israel, self-control would be at a premium. That people have to be able to know the difference between the extreme of nothing and of everything, the extremes of excess and the extreme of abstinence, and flow in between these. When you just simply jump because you want to jump, do because you want to do, say something without thinking about it, get angry for a reason without thinking about it, be in a bad mood in an instant because you can be, I want to tell you something. You're not in control of your spirit. You're not in control of yourself. And when you're not in control of yourself, how do you expect to be able to conquer anything? Because you're dictated by the lack of self-control. I want to close with this verse out of Proverbs. It's an interesting verse. Proverbs talks a lot about self-control all the way through. It starts at the beginning almost, and it doesn't, and in the end, it's still talking about it. But in Proverbs chapter 25, in verse 28, listen to what it says about temperance. It says, Solomon here is saying, like a city that is broken into and without walls is the man who has no control over his spirit. Again, like a city that is broken into and without walls is a man who has no control over his spirit. So what is it that the wise man is saying here? What's the riddle that he's bringing before us? What's this word picture, if you have it that way? What the wise man is saying is, when you don't have control over your spirit, you're like a city that has no protection. You see, the walls around the city, if you think about it, like if you go to Jerusalem, you'll see where there's the walls around the city. And during those times, the walls around the city, they were there for protection, almost like a fort, to protect from wild animals and protect from enemies. However, if you think about in the middle of the city, if you don't have these walls, the wild animals can come in and wreak havoc in the city, and also your enemies can come in and plunder your city. So what he's saying is, if you don't have control over your own spirit, people can come and plunder you at any time. You know how that works? You're driving down the road, somebody cuts you off, you don't have control over your spirit. The next thing you know, you're doing things and saying things that you shouldn't be doing towards another driver. You come home and your children irritate you, and you find out you blow up over them, whatever the case might be. And so whatever it might be, you come home and maybe it's overeating, maybe it's other things, but the idea is that you have absolutely no control over the circumstances that are dictating your life, because you haven't transcended the circumstances by having self-control. When we live a temperate life, we live a life of wisdom. We live a life that's pleasing to God, and more than that, one in which we share in the very divine nature of God. In other words, God is known for self-control. He's perfect self-control. He's never anything but perfect self-control. And when we exhibit self-control, we participate in that divine nature. It's the same thing when we talked about courage the last several weeks. We participate in a divine nature when we're courageous in ourselves, when we have that virtue. In the future, we're going to be talking about other virtues. We're going to be talking about justice. We're going to be talking about common sense or prudence as well. And we're going to ultimately end up talking about humility. But today we're talking about self-control. Maybe the question we've got to ask ourselves is, how are we doing with self-control? Do we find ourselves saying things we shouldn't say because we're not in control of our spirit? Even sometimes thinking things that we shouldn't think because we're not in control of our spirit. Or doing things we shouldn't do because of the same. So today I've got to ask myself a question, Father's House. I have to ask myself the question, how am I doing with self-control? Self-control doesn't start with an outward action, whether it's speech or it's an action. It begins with a spirit inside of me that's either in control or out of control, not in control. When hard times come, when I know that it would be easy to do something and lose control, am I still in control of my spirit? Am I in control of my mind? You'll find that if you are, in any situation that you're in, you will not be shaken. You will not make a rash move. You will wait, be patient, and make the right one. So today I've got to ask myself, how am I doing in the area of self-control? Secondly, how are you doing? I hope that as we talk more through this idea of temperance, that it kind of begins to stick in your spirit what it is. Because if you can understand what temperance is, courage, and the other things we're talking about, and you can begin to then be thinking about them whenever you enter into a situation where there's a high pressure thing, a high pressure circumstance that has high stakes, that you'll always be able to recall what the virtues are and act in a virtuous manner. Well, I hope that you've thought about it today and that you'll think about it the rest of the week, as I know that I will. Next week, we're going to talk about what courage looks like in a person. And I'm going to pick a very, very special person. You won't want to miss it because she is amazing. All right. God bless you. Have a great day. I'll see you next week.